we're aiming to de-risk and make sure that founder is focused far more on what they're good at rather than what they're not good at, and help them save time by spending their time wisely with the right funds, not the wrong ones. Because that again, founders follow a shotgun approach far too often in terms of marketing what they're trying to sell, which is their equity. You go up to an ice cream van and you try and sell them a cruise ship. You're just speaking to the wrong market. That happens a lot with founders going to investors that are never going to invest in what they're doing, and spending that time potentially burning that bridge or whatever the relationships were that potentially got them introduced to that fund. All of that is something that we want to avoid. What's the problem you're solving? Because if you're not building, the next set of, foundational models or like NVIDIA chips that are custom built, or chip design that are custom built for some of the newer use cases and demands that AI on compute power, then describing yourself as an AI powered whatever it is the same as saying my company is electric powered. Electric powered what? What's the problem you're solving? I'd say stay focused on the problem you're solving, stay focused on the customer. I don't think the customer actually cares too much about what tech stack you're using. I think they care far more about the outcome that is achieved by all of the components that you've put together to produce that customer outcome.
It just adds a whole load of unnecessary structured pressure, but it creates what I would say is performance. And I don't mean performance of the business, I mean like theatre. And there's a lot of theatre that the founder feels that they need to do to portray early stage success, traction, growth, market potential. They get into that whole narrative to try and sell to the VCs. They believe raising money is a signal that the market is ready for what they've built. And the VCs don't have a clue. They have a great big diversified portfolio with bets and counter bets. And not only is that a fail scenario, I think it's really dangerous.
Baseline.
The baseline is designed to create an emotional response.
I've seen things you won't believe.
More human than human.
Make you question everything.
So ShipShape.vc is free to use investment search engine that just aggregates data from around the web. We look at deals that funds are doing, and we essentially from that help founders do their research. So let's say you're building advanced composites for rockets that are going to be reusable. We'll enable founders to see which funds around the world fund that type of stuff. And yeah, so that's been definitely a sort of labour of love. It's taken, we're 5 years in nearly to that process. We've been live for about 2.5. We had to sort of build a search engine before there was any of this ChatGPT and widely available accessible LLMs. So it's been really fun, and we still got a long way to go in terms of solving that properly. I'm also involved in a podcast which is around investor horror stories. So we tend to speak with experienced folks from the industry, and we go through some anonymized stories that founders have gone through with investors. And the idea there is to help founders who are maybe going through this for the first time to learn from the mistakes that potentially others have made without needing to repeat them themselves, because any one of these mistakes could be fatal for their business. It's quite fun.
Do you think that why do you think investment is important?
I think it's important because it is capital being directed to places where it could be most effectively spent. I think that's it. And I think there's a huge amount of asymmetry of information especially in the early stage, where you've got quite opaque capital structures that you might not necessarily know how to go and approach, or even who to go and approach from that perspective. And you've got to have you've essentially got to have improved efficiency and effectiveness at the point in time where someone has literally come up with an idea, or like you've got a university student, PhD researcher, for example, a professor who has discovered a novel solution to a problem. You need to try and allocate capital to that in order to see whether or not that's going to succeed as a venture, particularly if it's capital intensive. And so, the importance of solving this problem is one of how quickly is humanity going to be able to solve not just the problems of today, but actually the problems of the future too. So yeah, the time lag is quite long, and the death rate is very high. It's always going to be very high, but even if you make a marginal impact on the death rate, i.e. if you have like a 10% increase in the number of businesses that are successful using novel technologies to solve problems that haven't yet had a proper solution to them, then you basically get compounding benefits from making even that marginal impact.
I just have this nagging feeling, and I've experienced bootstrap through to exit versus VC backed, and including corporate VC as well, is that founders can become very easy derailed into thinking that raising money and round structure and quality of investors and brand of investor is actually what they're doing, when it's actually not.
Yep.
And speaking from personal experience, once you enter that, what I would say is a traditional VC-backed, pre-seed, potentially SEIS, Angel, EIS, to formalized, structured seed, quality of lead investor with additional angels who can add value, through to potentially, Series A, Series B. I think that it just adds a whole load of unnecessary structured pressure. And that pressure, it creates something that, maybe slightly provocative, but it creates what I would say is performance. And I don't mean performance of the business, I mean like theatre. And there's a lot of theatre that the founder feels that they need to do to portray early stage success, traction, growth, market potential. Like they get into that whole narrative to try and sell to the VCs. And two things can happen. VCs bail out, because once you've got an investor, if they're not going to do a follow-on, what's the optics? What does the market going to think? If the lead investor doesn't go, how are we going to get new investors? Like the complexity of going down this route. And then the other thing is that the complexity of taking external investment, is this scenario that people get into where they believe raising money is a signal that the market is ready for what they've built. And the VCs don't have a clue. They have a great big diversified portfolio with bets and counter bets, and the founder starts to believe that raising money, i.e. validation from the venture world, is validating the market fit of what they're building. And not only is that a fail scenario, I think it's really dangerous.
Yeah. The VCs are taking a lot of bets, hoping that a few pay off big. Lots of the others will have that problem of the failure that they've built something for a market that doesn't exist, or doesn't exist yet, or may never exist. And I think you see a lot of that performative marketing from founders, because they think, they may well need that capital, and they therefore got to start playing the game in the way that others are in order to market their equity, which is essentially what they're doing. And I think a lot of this boils down to fundraising is a sales process. You want to market your equity to the relevant part of the market, i.e. the funds or investors that are going to be most interested in what you're doing. And founders have to engage in doing that. And the way that some of them do it is going to be very performative. It's going to be more style over substance. It's going to be concentrating on potentially the wrong pain points. And yeah, it's a huge distraction, but it's a necessary one in many instances for founders to market their equity in the way that means that ultimately they get the best price and the best deal for the company. So yeah, I think it's unfortunately a necessary evil, even if it is in many instances very wasteful for the resources that the company has.
Why would they not focus on early stage customers?
A very good question. That's where I think most companies should be doing that. It's the only type of capital that isn't going to be sort of dilutive or necessarily like risky. It's the best form of capital to fuel your business is revenue from customers. It's the only form of sort of capital injection that you really can learn from and I suppose improve upon. Every time a customer's paying you and is giving you feedback or giving you data points on something you might be doing right, that's much more useful in the long run than even the most specialized investor who truly understands an industry. They're not going to have the same ability to track through time the data points and the product features or service features that matter to the market, because the market's always changing. Even someone with a great depth of expertise and knowledge about a market isn't going to be able to track the current movements and trends within a market.
There's a lot of noise at the moment, I find. Like if I log on to a platform like LinkedIn, I don't even know where to start. You know, the amount of noise and certainly with these hype cycles, I kind of saw it with blockchain. Obviously, generative AI is doing the same thing with a different level of practical success. How do founders navigate that noise?
Many don't. One of the things that we've seen with the sort of AI hype cycle, our search engine is free to use. Most of our users are founders who are looking for investors, but we do also get investors using us to try and identify other portfolio companies that other funds might have invested in certain sectors and fields. And so we've seen investors use more search phrases that put AI in them, but as a proportion of total searches, investors haven't changed what they're searching for that much, whereas a huge number of founders are now trying to put in AI into their search phrase. And if you think about the amount of capital that's being allocated towards AI, yes, it's absolutely huge in terms of the amount of capital that's now being directed to companies and projects within that field. But actually, founders are over-indexing on that signal. They're often trying to insert AI somehow into something which is like, you're actually making grocery delivery simpler, or like you're keeping milk fresher for longer. But somehow founders are not describing the problem they're actually solving. They're describing just one part of the tech stack that they're using to help them solve it, thinking that that's going to yield more interest and going to capture more of the investor market's interest in their business. So yeah, in terms of how founders can stay clear of that hype, what's the problem you're solving? Because if you're not building, the next set of foundational models or like NVIDIA chips that are custom built, or chip design that are custom built for some of the newer use cases that and demands that AI places on compute power, like then describing yourself as an AI powered whatever it is, like is the same as saying my company is electric powered. Like electric powered what? Like what's the problem you're solving? I'd say stay focused on the problem you're solving. Stay focused on the customer. I don't think the customer actually cares too much about what tech stack you're using. I think they care far more about the outcome that is achieved by all of the components that you've put together to produce that customer outcome.
For founders in AI, everything is moving so quickly. I saw this in the blockchain world. You built a product, traditional, even with agile development. I know they've got vibe coding and this sort of stuff these days, but if I talk about, a 7 to 8 person dev team building for 3 years, the technical debt that is created by the fact that LLMs are being updated every week, it's highly competitive, multi-billion-dollar companies are arriving every month. I think that the barrier to entry for startups is, from a technology MVP level, has probably never been lower. But the barrier to getting into production, into actual practical applications where the value can be seen and then you can start to scale, I would say is probably higher than it's been. Do you know? So the seduction of being a founder, identifying as a founder and being a founder, everybody can kind of be a founder now. But there's a wall that feels like it's higher than it's ever been, which is that barrier to actual practical application of technology.
Yeah, and how you build infrastructure that scales easily, because taking vibe coding as an example, you can knock something up in a few hours that can have some relatively sophisticated thinking that's gone into the building of whatever that is. But what you don't have is all of the infrastructure that sits behind that, from a how do you secure the data? What are the additional processes that you might need to carry out that aren't dependent on essentially almost like a sandbox that you can create very easily within, but there are lots of other things outside that sandbox that you are going to need to have and integrate in order to build a business, not just a concept. I do think it's amazing and it's a fantastic step forward to reduce the cost of taking a step back. I remember when we were just starting out, for a few years, founders would go and spend $80K to go pay an IT shop somewhere to go and build an MVP for them. The fact that founders can do that for basically nearly free today is brilliant. That's 80K times 1,000 companies a year, let's say, that has been saved. And very often that's a very valuable 80K because it's come from, people who don't have that much on top of that 80K, or from their friends and family. That's a huge saving that matters a lot to the people that would have contributed that 80K. So I think that's a hugely beneficial step forward. But it still does not a business make having that MVP built very quickly.
But if everybody can do it, why would anybody buy someone else's?
That's where I think if this is no longer the bottleneck, what are the other bottlenecks? And there will always be another bottleneck. It could be, the quality of the distribution and the partnership channels, for example, that a business has that are based potentially on human networks that are really difficult to replace. You can't build those overnight. It can be based upon, it can be based upon the thinking behind a particular process. So whilst there's going to be an outcome that's you can see on a screen, actually the steps that are taken to arrive at that outcome and the thinking that's had to go into arriving at that, again, is something which I think other people will pay for, because in theory you can create all this stuff very easily, but actually how well as a system has it been thought through in terms of actually, I think in particular for both complex and actually simple systems. In theory, payments should be simple. Actually, it's extremely complicated, and there's still a lot of money to be made in shaving one bip off of the transaction. There's a huge amount of money that will be made there, and people will pay a fortune for it, even if actually they know how to create it themselves. Because actually, why would you take that risk on internally? Take the risk of the distribution and marketing risk, the validation risk. There's still lots of risks that others will pay for not needing to take because you've already taken those risks.
I want to come to this point that you just said about networks and distribution being increased. I mean, I would say they are increasingly differentiating, which, is, in fact, I was in preparation when I was looking at ShipShape, Harvard Business Review, 80+% of early stage VC funding goes to repeat founders or highly networked founders because they're from a trusted network. So, how are you helping people outside those networks, and how are you validating that they are? How can you afford them trust? Because they're not part. Because if you don't know who they are, how can you afford them trust that they are worthy of investment? I.e., going to work hard, going to operate legally, going to operate with transparency.
We don't. Is the honest answer, and will have been used by, like, the search engine will have been used by companies that ultimately don't deserve that trust. There will be brilliant founders, and I think the vast majority of founders are genuinely wanting to solve a problem. But there'll be others out there who are chancers. They're just in it to see, like, to live a lifestyle, for example. So we don't take that risk of vetting a founder on. That's not something we do. We put research in front of founders that then enables them to see who they ought to be building relationships with, and thinking about, like, the 20% of capital that gets allocated to those who are going at this for the first time. I think you're also likely to have, like, within that statistic, I think you're going to have those founders that are going at this again almost being able to skip a stage. So they're probably able to go out and raise 5 million off the bat rather than needing to go and look at the smaller rounds. So you'll have far fewer rounds contained within that 80% of the second-time founders going at this. For those who are in that 20% of capital going to first-time founders, lots of those rounds are going to be, obviously the inverse of that is that lots of those rounds are going to be far smaller to start with anyway. But then you've also got, again, this comes down to marketing. Founders are essentially, part of the product, part of the transaction that an investor is going to be looking to purchase essentially a slice of. These obviously very complicated transactions. Like, buying a slice of a business is not this does make me really frustrated when you see founders reaching out immediately with, like, a pitch deck saying, "Will you invest?" These are like, would you buy my house? It's going to be £600,000. I've not given you anywhere near enough detail or data or information or your knowledge about me for you to come to any kind of educated decision as to whether or not that's a transaction that you want to proceed with. But that's essentially what lots of founders are doing. They're sort of saying, here's a really complicated, like, transaction, yes, no. And that's not something which is, it's not an approach that's likely to succeed. You might, in some instances, there might be some funds who just, like, want to get rid of capital because that's the way that they make their money, is by deploying and making sure that they've got, AUM that they can charge a percentage on. But for those founders in that 20% that are going at this for the first time, the reason why we exist is so that they know who they've got the highest chance of marketing their company successfully to. So, let's say you're building, technology to power the grid or make the grid more scalable from an electricity perspective. Yes, you might have success from generalist funds, but actually, if there's a specialist fund out there that only funds technology that helps improve electricity grids around the world, you're far more likely to get a good price and a fair price for the value of the equity.
If you really believe that somebody with a master's in electro-engineering out of, I'll even call it one of the Oxbridge universities, can raise 5 million quid and build something that hasn't been identified and they can build something off the back of a deck that they've produced with ChatGPT that hasn't been identified by one of the big power providers with billions of dollars of R&D. I just worry that you're setting these people up to be crushed.
I don't...
Unless they've already proven a patent, a unique method, a cohort of clients who are paying for what they've built, maybe a co-build with a big engineering company. Like, unless there's some form of industrial or financial validation, the idea of raising money, for me personally, is madness.
Yeah, we're not talking about necessarily.
Do you know what I mean? Like, that was provocative, but deliberately so, because it's back to this point about where should the priorities be for somebody with an idea.
Yeah, you're very unlikely, even with like an Oxbridge background, you're very unlikely to go and raise 5 million off the bat for what it is that you're doing without any validation from the market. But that's not. I don't think that's the problem. Like we cannot solve impossible problems, if that makes sense. What we can potentially do is, let's say you've got that researcher who's discovered a new material that better insulates whatever it is, and actually the implications of that globally are potentially significant. We're not there to make that leap straight away. That founder still needs to go on that journey. But what we can help them do is identify which individuals at which funds they should start building a relationship with. Because again, even with all that validation, like it's not going to be, or it's very unlikely to be a very quick turnaround time of request for capital to the giving of the capital. But actually, how do you front load the building of that relationship that builds the trust and ultimately de-risks the fund's interpretation of the business in that way, basically. So like that's what we're aiming to do here. We're aiming to de-risk and make sure that founder is focused far more on what they're good at rather than what they're not good at, and help them save time by spending their time wisely with the right funds, not the wrong ones. Because that again, founders follow a shotgun approach far too often in terms of marketing what they're trying to sell, which is their equity. It's the same as, I don't know, you go up to an ice cream van and you try and sell them a cruise ship. You're just speaking to the wrong market. That happens a lot with founders going to investors that are never going to invest in what they're doing, and spending that time potentially burning that bridge or whatever the relationships were that potentially got them introduced to that fund. All of that is something that we want to avoid.
What would you say to avoid that? What would you say the 3 key areas, or handful of areas a founder should be focused on developing before they enter that domain, to avoid that exact point you like, burning time, burning relationships? Like what should they be going to that discussion with?
It depends on the stage, always. So if we define that, then I think we can define what your prerequisites are going to have to be. It will vary by sector, it will vary by stage. And you inevitably have, the friends, family, and fools, like early stage investors that will just put money into something, and it's just pure like potluck. It's not potluck, but they're taking a gamble, and it might not even be a very educated gamble beyond what they know about that person's character. That's it. So it's a very different set of prerequisites for that type of investor versus a fund that's potentially looking at investing 20 mil, where you're very unlikely to get 20 million without any type of validation. You're going to need to get validation from customers. If you're in like capital intensive industries, whether that's like life sciences, biotech, like people who are building things like hardware for space, for example, you might not have any paying customers and you might still be able to raise 20 million because the dynamics of that field are so different. But you're very unlikely to raise 20 million without some sort of validation. I don't know if it's like an MOU or an LOI from like NASA, for example. It's going to take something of that sort to say, we think this is worth testing. We will do X if Y. That's the sort of validation that you're going to need at those later stages.
What are the areas that you're seeing as exciting at the moment? I caught something about developing medicines in space and actual in space manufacturing. That seems to be an emerging kind of area. What are you seeing through your search engine that is getting a lot of attention?
Yes, so I mean, space is obviously a big area of growth. I think there have been lots of attempts to create almost like new economies that VCs and investors get very excited about. So thinking about like the metaverse, for example, lots of funds got very excited about the prospect of a new economy, and through hundreds of millions, tens of billions into that domain because they thought there's a new economy being created here. I think space is a real new economy. You've got resource riches in space that can be practically tapped into, ignoring all of the immediate value that you get from the ability for sort of communications, etc., to happen above the Earth's atmosphere, which has obviously like lots of other benefits. So space is a really exciting one. I think there's also increased interest in defense and security. We have essentially been paying very low insurance coverage for the insurance policy that protects the nation and nations around the world. And I think everyone's realizing that actually that premium's going to go up and it needs to go up. And the sums involved are not small, especially at a global level. So I think that's an area that's another area that we see increased interest, both from companies who are building in that space, but also from funds and other institutionals that, they've realized that countries around the world are going to be spending more on this insurance policy. Therefore, there is money to be made within it. Therefore, there's increased interest. But it's an insurance policy, ultimately. So lots of these companies will have dual uses. So there's a brilliant company in Norway, for example, that they've got essentially a fleet of drones. They've built both the hardware and the software that picks up forest fires. But through thermal imaging, they're also able to monitor borders. That's a dual-use technology. You've got the same with low Earth orbit satellites as well that can do very similar things. But yeah, they're investing in this type of insurance policy. Is through things like DARPA has given us an amazing array of material and science benefits that have real economy implications. We just didn't realize it at the time. I think it's like the post-it notes, sort of the sticky notes, was a failed DARPA program. But they realized that actually there's a commercial upside.
Listen, you've mentioned something there, and it came across, is that and I haven't thought about it like this, so just meeting you today has given me a whole new portal into overthinking, which is this idea that new markets will emerge as we move past certain boundaries. So, for example, markets of creating medicines in space and manufacturing is once we actually get up there and start being a little bit more, existing comfortably in space or needing to, then that will open up a new market. It's brought to mind Mira Murati's recent fundraise, I think 2 billion, a 10 billion valuation, as I understand, for thinking machines, which, she's an amazing. She was CTO at OpenAI, so she's a repeat founder. She's got the network. So talking about all of the things we've talked about, how ShipShape helped people, she's obviously hacking that system by having she's an amazing founder, amazing technologist. But that entire thesis is built upon when we have AGI, what's the world going to look like and what it's going to need. So I find it really interesting that it's very easy to fixate on a problem that exists today to help companies fix, which many people seem to be doing with the augmentation of OpenAI's, ChatGPT and others. But to give this opportunity to say, okay, if to your logic point, when AGI exists and everybody has universal access to super intelligence, what does commerce, what does payments, what does innovation look like? That is a fascinating. Patents, for example, intellectual property. When you have instant generation of, instantly, a 3-year patent application seems somewhat out of date. So what does IP look like post AGI? This is fascinating.
I couldn't agree. Like you're going to have the rapid, in many instances, you might have the rapid devaluation of whatever a patent might be worth across a wide variety of fields. Actually, I just wanted to mention that there's a really cool company in Wales, just based down the road from where our office is in Cardiff, called Space Forge, and they recently raised. It was a really it was quite a large round, But they basically are doing sort of compound semiconductors, the production of those in space, because you've essentially got a permanent clean room.
Interesting.
And you've got the ability for like almost like perfect crystal formation, because zero gravity, and therefore you can increase like yield essentially for chips. So yeah, there's some very high value stuff that you can do, and so yeah, essentially a perfect vacuum that's zero gravity.
Interesting, especially with if you're operating in space, you're not necessarily affected by geopolitics. You look at the state of GPU manufacturing in Taiwan and how the whole global supply chain is at risk. I can see why companies are starting to now think, is there safe, financially optimized manufacturing spaces? What a fascinating idea.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. And actually, there's another cool company which is worth mentioning as well, called Space Dots, who essentially they monitor space environment. So everything from like let's just take radio frequency. They do both human and that's was like natural and unnatural space environment monitoring, because actually space is becoming an increasingly contested domain between nation states. And whilst it's not hot, it's not become hot up there. Like, you've got satellites that are going to be targeting other satellites within the sort of communications chain and infrastructure of rival nations, or even commercial satellites that have got dual use applications. Like, even if it's just like an Earth observation satellite that has got military application. And so you might be a private company up in space, but actually the presence or the fact that you are domiciled in a certain jurisdiction means that the government will potentially be able to force the use of whatever that asset is for their own military purposes. And then you've ultimately got to think about like, who's targeting your assets, and are you targeting the right assets of any potential opponent? And Space Dots essentially help to essentially help do threat identification, both from environmental factors and non-environmental factors in space, which is, I think, just fascinating.
Hugely. And the rapid evolution of low Earth orbit technology, obviously, I'm a Starlink customer as a backup. And that investment in Starlink, you just get fast, the bandwidth's getting faster. It's getting more reliable as they update those, new generation satellites go up. These are not things that last 100 years. They're low cost burn up in the atmosphere. I mean, we don't want them raining down on us, but there's an idea that agile, incremental development, which has come from Silicon Valley and other software development methodologies, but you're just getting more, better technology once you're into that subscription. So low Earth orbit seems to be something that is going to become, if you think about a control point for drones, for visual identification of things in farming or battle space, it's going to become increasingly contested. I don't even know how do geographical boundaries just go upwards to infinity, or is space like a open area?
So caveat, I'm not a space lawyer.
No. Are there space lawyers?
There are space lawyers. Yeah, there are. Especially around things like collisions in space between different objects, etc.
Things are moving pretty fast as well, remember.
Indeed. So space is not owned by any one nation. That being said, I think the there's a funny anecdote I saw on Twitter. The Holy See has its own, i.e. the Vatican. The laws that govern jurisdiction within the Holy See essentially means that wherever a vessel has gone from to where the first human from that vessel then set foot on whatever that territory was, the archbishopric of the point from which the vessel originated is then automatically the archbishopric of wherever that vessel landed, which means that the moon actually falls under the Archbishopric of Florida. Whilst in theory I think international law means that international space law means that no one at the moment owns anything in space, I think the Holy See has already predefined that actually that at least falls under the Archbishop of Florida.
So I mean, something's going to have to be rewritten.
Yeah.
Do you think in our lifetimes we're going to see, common habitation of space? Because ISS seems to be in its final moments of its life. I don't see any new stuff going up there. Certainly not in our media. I don't know what other countries are doing. Nobody else has been on the moon. I know a few people have been close recently, but I have, since the 60s, which we're talking quite a long time ago now, we haven't seen that adoption of space as a usable manufacturing or residential habitat. Whereas it sounds like we could be seeing early shoots of that, certainly in terms of money investing in it.
Well, yeah, if you look at launch frequencies, I think Florida is now at like capacity.
Has he moved to Texas?
Yeah. So there are lots of other sites for launch, and those are like those are now either being utilized and indeed new ones are being built. So thinking about launch pads as being like almost like railway lines to the sky, as it were, or to space, like there is increasing capacity, and that is going to become a market. It already is a market. The cost of launching a kilogram of payload has dropped significantly versus 30 years ago, in part because you've actually got an increased amount of supply of essentially freight space for whatever your payload is. So yeah, we're definitely going to see greater use and greater uses of payloads in space, and being able to do cool stuff like making better chips in space, like which is amazing. The geopolitics on Earth is going to be increasingly governed by what happens in space.
I was watching one of your videos about your branding, and you were questioning whether ShipShape was the right brand. Maybe it needs to be Spaceship Shape.
Yeah, it's a can of worms.
Tell me a little bit about. Let's get into that, because I tell you what, Daniel, your detailed futurism in reach is enlightening me already. Like, I have not the application of manufacturing in space, whether this is a personal passion or we've just ended up here because of some of these amazing companies in South Wales, which is great to hear, because it has a bedrock and history of hard work, clever people, innovation. Obviously, a lot of government services out there, so there'll be a nice little halo effect from that. Wales is a place I love deeply. I used to kayak up in Bala.
Oh, nice.
And I mean, just beautiful, beautiful place. But your handle on this, you must be getting insight into the frontier of investor and founders. I wonder about, like, I can become quite easily obsessed with product market fit, whereas you've got this investor founder fit that you're kind of solving for. Does that feel like your focus, and how has your brand evolved?
Yeah, good question. I think we've nailed down like what's the reason why we exist, which is to make a better future happen faster. The name ultimately comes from essentially an accident. So when I left the previous company I was working at, I decided to set up a company, and I'd been still am reading a lot of like nautical history and naval history, and I just thought, actually, I really find it interesting how much of our modern lexicon comes from like naval terminology. So like whether it's showing someone the ropes, or is something shipshape and Bristol fashion, as it were, like as a means of describing something that's in good order. I just thought, okay, that's what I'm going to call the company. Didn't give it much thought, really. So we probably at some point ought to change the name so it's more like directly related to what it is that we're doing. But for the moment, it seems to stick. And there are however other good reasons to change the name, which is that it's difficult to pronounce in a sort of pre-watershed way if you have if your first tongue is one of East Asian. So you end up potentially saying sort of you say ShipShape in a post-watershed way. So it might be something that we need to think about in a rebrand for in the future for East Asia.
We are in a computer game.